So, wow, that felt like a quick week. It's hard to imagine a week went by since I talked to you last. So, so I look forward to hearing from you in the dialogue portion, just about your continuing exploration of wholesome and unwholesome as it arises in your experience, what you notice about that. And then what we also added last week, which was to bring in the awareness of the body, particularly the belly area. I gave some suggestions of how to awaken the belly intelligence and, just the indication that that may have something to do with being able to stay in your integrity, is having the belly be awake. So today I'd like to introduce yet another whole dimension of this, which is that of speaking. In fact, when we hear the word integrity, probably honesty is a very close synonym in most people's minds. To be able to speak what's true is a big part of integrity. When someone has integrity, you feel like what comes out of their mouth is the real thing. It's not hiding something. It's not being manipulative. And their actions sort of follow from their words. It's a big part of integrity. And so it gets named in the Eightfold Path. It gets its own limb of the eight. It's usually called right speech, or what I'm translating as attuned speech. So we'll be noticing more and more our speech in this course. So the whole subject of speech became apparent to me this week. I was talking with someone about, they were reporting their experience around complaining to their partner. And what they noticed is that they started to complain, and it's like they got hijacked by something. And they started complaining more and more and ending up kind of going into a rant. And finally the partner said, okay, I think I've heard enough. Which finally alerted this person to the fact that their speech had not been attuned. Somehow they had launched into a whole thing and had lost sight of who they were speaking to, lost sight of it being about communication, and had kind of gone into a whole tangent. And when I heard this, I thought, oh, yes, I've been there. I know the territory you're talking about. I certainly can get hooked into that myself. But it was a really fine example, I thought, of experience of unwholesome speech. And something felt bad about it. I mean, even before the partner stopped the conversation, as they reflected back on it, it actually didn't feel that good. There's something about the way they were complaining, the way they were getting angry, and so forth, didn't actually feel like it was restoring anything. Now, I really think one of the things we offer to each other as human beings is this listening. When somebody is kind of out of sorts or dysregulated or having a hard day, we can offer our witnessing presence and our loving presence to that. So I'm not saying don't ever talk to anybody when you're in a negative frame of mind. But it might actually be helpful to notice what keeps that within the bounds of wholesome. What actually allows that to unfold in a way that you get what you need there. Sometimes it has to do with the skill of the person listening and their sympathetic responses. Sometimes you, through your sympathetic response, can lead someone to the truth of their experience, Because in a funny way, often when we're complaining, we're out of touch with the truth of our experience. We're out of touch with our actual feelings, of being hurt, for example. Instead, we're focusing on irritation with someone else. It's so easy for us to move away from our suffering in that way. So when we think of attuned speech, what I would like you to think of is, first of all, telling the truth. But I think people are often confused as to what the truth is, because sometimes the truth is just how you're perceiving other people and the judgments that arise with regard to other people. And I'm going to suggest tonight that isn't the truth. That isn't telling the truth. Telling people your judgments about them is not telling the truth. Although you somehow hear people say, I'm the one who tells the truth. I'm going to tell the truth. And you listen to what they have to say, and it's sort of like, well, it's a perspective. It's an aversion-filled perspective on what's going on. But your mind is really clouded by aversion. And so it's not actually the truth. You often have to kind of, when the finger's pointed at someone else, you have to turn it around back at yourself. You have to actually say, what's going on here? What am I actually experiencing? And what would it actually feel good to tell another human being? What would actually restore me? What would actually connect me with myself? If I've suddenly got kind of dislocated from myself through anger or irritation, or even being hurt sometimes is not exactly so close to what's true. Knowing what's true is not as easy as we think. And so speaking what's true is often not as easy as we think. If we're speaking what's true, we are perhaps revealing something to someone else that they wouldn't know otherwise, and revealing something to ourselves when we're speaking truth. So check that out. So there are times when we kind of don't speak the truth by staying silent. Well, I think if it's a case that the truth, so to speak, the truth would just be your judgments and irritation about someone, then sometimes silence is the best policy, actually, until you can digest your own feelings and come out with something that might actually be more revealing, more disarming. Genuine revelation of yourself is usually disarming to another person. There's a whole skill around that. So it's more than just not saying anything false. To speak what's true is a whole skill of itself. I sometimes teach people this thing that I think works quite well, which is, especially when you have something difficult to say to someone, to break it up into parts, and say, a part of me really appreciates what you're doing here. You're trying to do something thoughtful. But another part of me, I notice, is irritated by the fact that you didn't do blah, blah, something like that. So you give all sides. And often when you're speaking from parts, when you're speaking about parts, it puts another person at ease. They know that you are self-possessed in a certain way in that moment. You're not just lashing out. It has a whole different feel to it. And so that can be part of telling the truth. The Buddhist teaching about attuned speech is actually broken down into 4 parts. And I think it's helpful to memorize the 4 parts. The first is they're actually presented in the negative form, which I don't know why this is so common the case. It's like the 10 commandments are all negative. Well, not all negative, but most of them are negative. The Buddhist kind of lists often can be what to avoid rather than what to do. So you refrain from speaking falsely, but that obviously has the side of to speak the truth. And I think part of the reason why these sort of moral lists focus on the negative is sometimes avoiding the negative is easier than doing the positive. You know, just avoiding saying things that are false, lying in the most like common sense of lying, is in some sense easier than actually knowing what's true, actually speaking the truth. Can be a very difficult thing. So that's number one, to speak the truth and to not speak falsely. The second is an interesting one, is to speak in a way that brings harmony rather than causes discord. Speak in a way that brings harmony rather than causes discord. Now, this is an interesting one. So one of the things I find interesting about it is the way it's often misinterpreted by people. They think it means that it can't say anything that's going to cause any conflict. That's not actually what it means, because sometimes skillfully bringing up conflict is exactly what it takes to bring harmony. That there can be a pseudo harmony because everybody's keeping their mouth shut. But it's not real harmony. It's not actually bringing people together. So if you say something to bring people together, it might initially ruffle feathers, which is why it's so important that you focus on the truth as best you can, which includes the self-disclosure of your own feelings and position with respect to that. So important. You know, I think often this is also pointing to the way that we might say things that don't need to be said. In other words, we don't need to tell somebody else what so-and-so said about them if that's going to split them apart. And if we're doing that sort of thing, what's really motivating us? You know, we've all known people who do this almost unconsciously in a group. So in a sense, the second part is saying, don't do that. But the positive part of it is hard. It's like, what's going to bring harmony in this group? And there are such polarized positions in this world today that sometimes it's hard to know what will bring harmony. One thing that I know brings harmony is empathy. You know, even if somebody is, say, taking a different political view than mine, I can make the effort to try to step in their shoes and see what is it they're seeing, to be curious about what they're seeing, like where are they coming from, and ask about that, and even let them know that I get something about where they're coming from. I remember having a conversation back in what election was it, 2016, when Trump was elected, and talking to my brother-in-law who voted for Trump twice. And you know, I made an effort here. And with the first election, I was more capable of empathy than the second one, I have to say. But in the first one, I said, you know, I can imagine sitting where you are that you don't really like the policies that the Democratic Party represents. And you may want to vote for someone like Trump who you think is going to bring your policies. And you're probably crossing your fingers and crossing your toes that things don't really go off the rails, because you know as well as I do that this man is not a very stable character. And sure enough, he just like lit up and said, yes, you know, that's exactly where I'm at, is that I'm not comfortable with him as a leader. I'm hoping there's a lot of good people behind, around him that will stop him from doing things. And so we had this conversation, and, I didn't say a lot of things that I wanted to say, but I thought it was worth the effort to kind of reach out and to say, I can understand a bit of where you may be coming from, and just test out the waters. So there's an example. If you're in a group where there's a lot of tension and a lot of fighting, try empathy toward the other side. Try seeing if you can state their position in a way that they would recognize is their own. So oftentimes we're stating other people's positions only in our terms, and it often involves labeling. There's nothing quite like being mislabeled to create enmity in a group, you know? So if you think you're being such and such and somebody else says you're this, you know, in a kind of an angry tone even, it's, first of all, it's very shocking to the system, provokes shame. If you want to throw a bomb into any discussion, use contempt in your voice. I guarantee any discussion will go worse if you start using contempt in your voice. And it happens all the time, I'm afraid to say. And people actually think they're being powerful. It's curious because there's this notion that strength lies in speaking the truth and speaking with a certain amount of anger and contempt. And it's actually, I think, a very weak position. So see if you can back off from that. That alone would begin to fulfill the second thing, is like, take the contempt out of your voice, take the talking down out of your voice. And so to do that, you also have to have an inner antenna for self-righteousness. You really have to have something resonate inside when it's like, Mark, you're sounding like you're getting self-righteous here, like you're better than them, or you're kind of like talking to them like they're stupid. It's not a good sign. So that kind of sensitivity is really helpful for the second part of attuned speech. Be attuned to what's going to bring harmony and what's going to, and not do what brings discord. And again, this does not mean you can't say anything that's going to be controversial or cause conflict, because bringing out a hidden conflict is potentially the best thing that one can do for a group if it's done with skill. And which brings us to the third point about attuned speech, which is to speak in a gentle manner and do not speak harshly. So in other words, the tone that you use is extremely important. In fact, if you can say the same thing with two different tones, and one will be heard and the other one won't, you know? If your voice conveys ease and gentleness, you won't arouse the sort of protective forces of the other person. You can disarm people just with the tone of your voice. It's not easy, especially in positions of conflict where your heart may be pounding and there's a lot of like adrenal flow, and that can easily be translated into aggressive speech very easily. A kind of adrenal thing. When you're scared, it really can go into an aggressive kind of stance. And again, people can fool themselves that this is powerful. Whereas, I've been in groups, I've been myself in groups, but when I've been the witness of somebody who's spoken and you can hear their voice kind of tremor because they're afraid, something is very powerful about that. I immediately start to listen in a different level. It's like willing to take in what this person's saying. And sometimes they're not saying it all that skillfully. It might involve some labeling and some thrashing around, but I can viscerally feel that there is, somebody who's scared here, and it shifts it. And it's quite the opposite of, I think, what people think is you want to sound tough and assured and like you know it all. And where sometimes when someone's taking a risk, it has a powerful effect on the group. So speak gently and avoid harshness. And then the final one is to say what's useful and avoid idle chatter. So that one's a little harder for me to interpret for people. And one thing it doesn't mean is small talk is bad. I think small talk is just a kind of way of being friendly. And when people don't know each other, they often say things that are fairly superficial, and that's just fine. because the intention behind it is to just be friendly, to begin to make some connections and so forth. So, and when people are together and they relax, there's a lot of chattering often going on. And I wouldn't necessarily want to make people all self-conscious about that in order to be good Buddhists. We don't want to do that. Go ahead, be unself-conscious about your speech with your friends. And but the one part of idle chatter that's spelled out specifically, which I think is worth paying attention to, is that of gossip. Notice when your kind of unrestrained speech with your friends begins to go into the territory of gossip, of saying negative things about people who aren't there. That's definitely the unwholesome territory. That's kind of the ground that this fourth thing I think was primarily about, is to avoid gossip, to avoid maybe also just filling the spaces. Have you ever noticed the difference between conversation that goes deep and conversation that stays shallow? What I notice is there's a whole different pace to it. And there's actually some room for silence. There's actually some pauses. And it can be sometimes that you go deep and everybody's kind of jumping in because there's so much to say about this topic. So I don't want to stress this point too much. But sometimes slowing it down. If you want, the category that I think of useful, not sure that word, useful, we'll talk about how to accomplish some task. I don't think it means that, but I think it means like actually sharing on a level where you walk away from the conversation and you're satisfied with a connection. Some real connection has been made. Whatever that is. And the kind of conversations I have on the street with people walking their dogs as I walk mine, it is often very satisfying. Not a whole lot is said, but it's often very satisfying. Feels really good. And science has even proven it, that the conversations we have through the day and through the week with people that we just happen to encounter, who we may know very little about, the person at the post office, or somebody who happens to be next to us in the line in the grocery store, actually have a huge impact on people's well-being. It creates this atmosphere of friendliness. So I don't want to, say that every conversation has to be deep, but maybe have your barometer be tuned to that satisfaction of the encounter. And it might just be a superficial friendliness, or it might be like, oh my goodness, I actually, really connected with that person. I feel like I know them better for that conversation. So there's a whole range there. There's a whole kind of spectrum, if you will, of the word useful. What I think the word useful mostly covers is it speech that genuinely connects the people who are speaking. Whereas, gossip, I don't think genuinely connects people. There's the appearance of connection, and everybody maybe jumps in, and there's a certain kind of laughter to it and so forth. But my unwholesome barometer doesn't tell me that actually people are closer for having had that conversation. All right, so I'm gonna close here. I think, a lot of fleshing out these four things are going to be in your practice of them, kind of noticing your speech through the week. So you'll be able to kind of feel the qualities of wholesome and unwholesome, and maybe you'll see where that actually fell in this kind of four parts of attuned speech. And mostly, I actually think the fourth one's a really important one. Just what's kind of the level of connection? What is the quality of the connection? And does it have a wholesome tone to it?